Good afternoon. Welcome to part 2 of the Public Service Department's webinar series. Today's webinar will go over Vermont's current renewable electricity policies and programs. I'm TJ Poor, Director of Regulated Utility Planning at the Public Service Department. This webinar and the webinar series is really intended to ground attendees in basic information on Vermont's electricity sources and policy from multiple vantage points. The first set of webinars, which covered the topic of where Vermont's electricity comes from, was held a couple of weeks ago and is available on the department's website at publicservice.vermont.gov/renewables. And we're looking forward to a good conversation today. Next slide, please. So many of you now know Public Service Department is the agency within the executive branch of state government that's charged with representing the public interest in matters regarding energy, telecommunications, water, and wastewater. We carry out this charge in part by providing long-range planning for the state's energy needs through the Comprehensive Energy Plan. This is really with the goal of meeting the public's need for least cost, environmentally sound, and reliable energy systems in both the short and the long term. Once again, we have the pleasure of having many key staff from the department, the best team in the best agency in state government here to support today's webinar and really made this possible. You'll hear a little later from Ann Margolis, Deputy Director of Planning, and Claire McElvany is our Data and Equity Policy Manager who'll help facilitate today's webinar. Others are helping by running the slides or available to answer questions as they come up or support in other ways. Before we get started, we'll go over some logistics for today. Next slide, please. First, please remain muted with the video off throughout the webinar. Use the chat box for questions. This is our primary means of having questions and answers. So this is a little change from the first round of webinars. Zoom should now be set up so that only the Public Service Department staff can see your questions. We received a whole lot of feedback that the chat was really distracting at the last webinars, both of the last webinars, and so we've adjusted accordingly. So when you have a question, please direct that question to Claire McElvany with a direct chat message, and she will be the one facilitating that Q&A portion. We hope that this is a better outcome so people aren't distracted by kind of the noise in the chat, and that we're better able to communicate clearly and clear information and have clarifying questions as we go. If the chat isn't an available option for you, you can raise your hand during the Q&A periods throughout the session using the icon shown on the screen. We'll do our best to answer questions that are relevant to this conversation. If we don't answer it, they may be addressed at the quote unquote parking lot sessions that we have scheduled for early March. Closed captioning is available for the webinar by clicking the appropriate button on Zoom, the icon you see there. Note that the captions are auto-generated, may not be 100% accurate, but should be helpful. And then finally, the webinar, like the first sessions, is being recorded and it will be posted on the department's website. Next slide, please. So reminder of the context of why we're here. This webinar is part of an effort to review our current state electricity policies and programs. And this is a direct recommendation from the state's Comprehensive Energy Plan. After hearing input over last summer and fall, we developed a 3-phase public engagement plan, which you can see here on the screen, that's consistent with that feedback and the environmental justice legislation that was passed in 2022. Right now, we remain in phase 1, where we're providing educational opportunities like this webinar to help raise awareness and hopefully help Vermonters learn about our electric energy system. It's an incredibly complex system with a lot of moving pieces. This is just an initial primer to kind of level up the conversation. We're beginning to hear what's important to you when it comes to our electricity supply, what issues are clear, what remains convoluted or unclear. As we move into spring and summer into phase 2, we expect to continue to engage in conversations through polling and focus group type engagement. And after getting a report on that in the summer, we'll look to develop recommendations on how Vermont can move forward with its electricity supply and then get feedback on those recommendations. The whole goal of this process is not just to hear from the usual suspects who are actively engaged in electricity policy already. We hear from them through kind of the normal channels. Instead, we're really hoping to engage a broader set of Vermonters in the issues that are affecting folks directly. So, instead of asking, developing the policy and asking, what do you think? We're trying to engage before we actually develop the policy, lift up voices of what's important as we develop it, and then go back once we've heard that and develop a policy based on those voices, go back and see if we got it right. The process is pretty new for the department and perhaps for state government. So we really appreciate your understanding as we're learning and as we make mistakes, like hopefully adapting the chat, for example, will improve these webinars. So if you could go to the next slide, please. We hope by the end of the day, end of today's webinar, you all attendees will better understand Vermont's current policies and programs that promote the adoption of renewable and or clean electricity, and also better understand how those policies have impacted the adoption of renewable electricity over time. These questions are and these objectives are trying to build on the first webinar's description of where our electricity comes from and how it gets to us. But first, we could go to the next slide. We'd like to understand who's in the audience. So we do have a short poll to help us do that. If you could go to the next slide again. A poll should be popping up on your screen momentarily. Answering the questions in the poll are voluntary. All the responses will be anonymous. Note that there are more than 1 or 2 questions here. Before you hit submit, please scroll down so you could answer all the questions if you choose to do so. We're really using the data here to help inform our outreach efforts as we go forward, to help us be transparent about what we did and didn't hear, and to offer context for our recommendations down the road. So please take a few seconds to answer these questions. Again, there's more than 1 question, so before you hit submit, please scroll down so you can respond to all the questions. As you're answering, I'll just remind folks again that in the chat, if you have questions and answers, if you have questions, please direct them to Claire McElvinney. We've shut off the chat for folks to see after feedback that it was really distracting last time. So please send directly to Claire McElvinney any questions you'd like to have answered or that pop up as you hear today's webinar. I'll give you about 15 more seconds to complete the poll. Okay, thank you for completing that poll. And then Adam, if you could go to the next slide, please. So let's get down to it. Let's start with an overview of our current policies and programs. So renewable energy policy in Vermont hasn't just been a thing in the last few years or even in the last decade. This slide starts in the late 90s, but even before that, Vermont was an early adopter of planning requirements that required our utilities to purchase power at least cost, including environmental costs. But today, we're going to just start our journey through time in 1998 with net metering. In that year, legislation was passed with an intention of allowing Vermont homes, businesses, and communities to generate their own power. For example, by putting solar photovoltaics on your rooftop or on a commercial building. A little later on, Ann Margolis will talk about how net metering has changed over the years and the current configuration of that policy. Moving forward on the timeline, in 2005, Vermont passed what was called the Sustainably Priced Energy Enterprise Development Program, which was known as SPEED. We often do whatever it takes to come up with a name that makes a good acronym. But the intent of this was really to encourage utilities to sign long-term, stably priced contracts with renewable energy resources in Vermont and developing the marketplace for those kinds of projects. One of the barriers for renewable developers at the time was the ability to receive long-term contracts or enter into long-term contracts with providers. And this program facilitated utilities doing just that and signing those types of contracts. One of the features of the SPEED program at the time is that it did not require that utilities keep or retire renewable energy certificates or RECs. Those are the environmental attributes associated with the generation that we talked about last time. We did talk about it last time, but I'll actually go over RECs because they're really important, renewable energy certificates, again, in a few minutes here. Next on the timeline is in 2009, Standard Offer Program was developed. This program sought to encourage small-scale renewable energy of all different types through state government purchase of energy, with a requirement for utilities to then purchase that same energy from the government. That's what we term a centralized procurement. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but the Standard Offer Program was scheduled to end in 2022.
Yeah, I should turn this on.
Lastly, what I'll go over here, we'll go over here today. In 2017, Vermont's Renewable Energy Standard was created. This effectively replaced the SPEED program, the Sustainably Priced Energy Enterprise Development Program, and that requires electric distribution utilities to purchase an ever-increasing amount of electricity from renewable energy resources over time. Utilities show compliance through with their obligations through the retirement of renewable energy certificates. So a big difference from the SPEED program. So these are kind of the high-level programs we're going to cover in a lot more detail today: net metering, Standard Offer, and the Renewable Energy Standard. Next slide, please. So this slide really shows how these policies and programs fit together. The Renewable Energy Standard, or the RES, as I may say, I'll try not to use the acronym, but really sets the overarching requirements for increasing the supply of renewable electricity in the state. So looking at this graphic on the left side of your screen, resources developed under the other programs now really support achieving the requirements of the Renewable Energy Standard. Net metering resources fall within those overarching requirements of the Renewable Energy Standard. Standard Offer resources fall within those overarching requirements. And other resources, like those contracted directly by utilities, fall within the overarching requirements of the standard. And so one of the tensions that we've seen, and we identified this in the Comprehensive Energy Plan in calling for a review of programs, is that these programs and efforts that support meeting the RES, the Renewable Energy Standard, predate the Renewable Energy Standard. The programs were developed at different times for different purposes, and the goals of the programs aren't always completely aligned. And so we want to really kind of look at that and look at our programs comprehensively in this entire process, so that we can see, you know, do we want to align those goals? Do we want to move forward in a different manner? So let's start with the most recent first, and the renewable energy standard on the next slide, please. So Vermont's renewable energy standard is really like those in other states. In most other places, it's called a renewable portfolio standard, but we've called it something a little different here, but has a similar structure. Excuse me. So the renewable energy standard requires Vermont electric distribution utilities to purchase or own a specific amount of electricity generated from renewable resources. And that, as I mentioned earlier, as evidenced by renewable energy certificates. It has 3 tiers, which I'll describe in a little more detail shortly, but broadly speaking, tier 1 can be thought of as an umbrella tier. It places requirements on utilities for total renewable energy that they must provide to their customers. So that's kind of the overarching tier that tier 2 fits within. And tier 2 places requirements on utilities for the amount of small scale distributed renewable energy generation that is located in Vermont and built after a certain date. So that it sets that requirement that utilities must provide this much from these particular resources to their customers. Tier 3 is a little bit different. This is the one area where we're unlike other states. Tier 3 places a requirement on utilities to reduce fossil fuel consumption of their customers. So engaging in activities that actually cause their customers to use less oil or kerosene or propane. This webinar is about our renewable electricity programs and our supply. So it really mostly involves tiers 1 and 2, but tier 3 is really an important part of the renewable energy standard and Vermont energy policy. So I didn't want to go without talking about it at least a little bit here. It's really one of the reasons you see utilities out there promoting measures like electric vehicles and heat pumps or line extensions that avoid diesel generation from maple syrup generators or companies boiling sap. So that's kind of the high level overview of our renewable energy standard. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that we're not alone in having renewable electricity purchasing requirements. We're one of 30 jurisdictions that have a renewable energy standard, and each standard really varies based on the goals of the particular state or the territory. So let's take a step back for a minute. That's the really high level overview. If you could go to the next slide. But I am throwing around the word renewable an awful lot so far in this webinar. So want to step back and just remind folks how I define renewable. And it's really not me defining renewable or the Department of Public Service. It's Vermont's legislature who defines renewable. And that's how I'm using it here. I don't really like to read slides, and I did this in the last webinar too, but I do really think it's important that renewable energy is defined by state statute as energy produced using a technology that relies on a resource that is being consumed at a harvest rate at or below its natural regeneration rate. Statute goes on to clarify that nuclear fuel is not considered renewable, and there is some history with the statute. At one point, there was a 200 megawatt limit, a size limit on the size of hydroelectric facilities that could be considered renewable. That limitation was removed by the legislature in 2010. So all hydroelectric facilities are considered renewable by statute. And so that's how we'll talk about renewable here. And when I'm kind of setting the background, this is what I mean by renewable. And that can be a conversation going forward in this engagement process. So I wanted to step back because I was talking a lot about renewable energy certificates. And I think this may be the only repeat slide from the first webinar, mostly a repeat, but renewable energy certificates are complicated and we may have some new attendees here. So I wanted to go over it again. As we talked about last time, every megawatt hour, and recall megawatt hour is the common measure of energy, which represents the amount of power delivered or generated over 1 hour. Every megawatt hour in New England, whether it's fossil or renewable, it's tracked. And the attribute of that same megawatt hour is also tracked separately. And so if a resource is renewable, it's then assigned what's called the Renewable Energy Certificate, or a REC. One for every megawatt hour generated, that equals one renewable energy certificate. So the goal of renewable energy certificates and the theory behind them are to create a revenue stream for development that encourages either new renewable energy development of desired types or sizes, or continued operation of existing renewable resources, and or to also give credit to entities who secured renewable resources prior to the creation of policy programs like renewable energy standards. Renewable energy certificates can be bundled with the electricity in a purchase or sale agreement, or they can be sold separately from the electricity, so they can be unbundled. So these renewable energy certificates are the mechanism that states all across New England and really across the country. We showed that that chart of the country's renewable portfolio standards that states use to measure compliance towards their renewable electricity requirements. And so Vermont is no different here. We have those obligations in the renewable energy standard, and renewable energy certificates are what's used to measure compliance. These RECs demonstrate that the electrons were created by renewable energy, and they prevent two different entities from claiming credit for supporting the same resource. So we received some feedback from our first set of webinars that the renewable energy certificates and their trading markets are confusing. So that's why we wanted to go over it here as we talk about some of the policies and programs, but we've also are organizing or trying to organize another future dedicated webinar where we've asked an independent consultant, Sustainable Energy Advantage, to provide an overview of renewable energy certificates and the markets in which they operate, followed by a question and answer session directly on renewable energy certificates. So we'll keep that in mind. We can answer clarifying questions about them today to the extent we can, but we also are planning this future session in late February or early March, which we're really excited about, to help again kind of level up the conversation and all be speaking the same language and with the same information. So let's get back to tier 1 of the renewable energy standard. Any renewable resources that can provide power to the New England region are eligible to be used as compliance to meet our electric utilities tier 1 obligation. So this includes imports from outside New England, like Quebec and New York, regardless from when the resource was built. Tier 1, you'll see in a future slide, tier 1's often met with hydroelectric resources, with renewable energy certificates from hydroelectric resources. So utilities are required to purchase the rights to this type of renewable energy that started at 55% of their sales in 2017, increasing until it reaches 75% in 2032. The line from 2017 to 2021 on this chart shows actual compliance with the renewable energy standard as represented by retirements of those renewable energy certificates. And so by retiring a renewable energy certificate, what I mean is that a utility is not allowing anyone, including that same utility, to ever use that certificate again for any other purpose, but for measuring compliance in that compliance year. So you can see there in 2021, utility compliance was 71% of their retail sales when the obligation was only 59%. So our utilities over complied with the renewable energy standard. Some of our utilities have their own goals for renewable supply that exceed the requirements of the renewable energy standard. Some other Vermont utilities were 100% renewable prior to the renewable energy standard's existence and have maintained that portfolio. So there's a couple of different reasons why we're over complying on tier 1. So, and now we'll go to tier 2 of the renewable energy standard. So eligible resources to meet tier 2 obligations include a small scale distributed generation located in Vermont that was constructed after June of 2015. They're less than, by small scale, I mean less than 5 megawatts in size. And while megawatt hour measured energy over time, a megawatt is really a measure of power, like what can be instantaneously provided at one time. Tier 2 is often met with net metering resources, standard offer resources, and utility contracts. We'll get into net metering and standard offer in a little bit here. Its requirements began at 1% of utility sales in 2017 and increased to 10% of utility sales in 2032. Actual compliance thus far has been, in this case, equal to the tier 2 requirement. So tier 2 resources also count for tier 1. It's what one might call a carve out, which is not uncommon across renewable portfolio standards across the country. And remember, tier 1 sets the total amount, and some of that must come from tier 2. You can see the difference here in how much of the total amount needs to come from tier 2 resources over time, and increasing to 10% over the next 10 years. So one more slide before we pause for questions here. This slide here shows what type of resources utilities are using to meet renewable energy standard obligations. We're starting on the right-hand side of this with tier 2. About 61% of tier 2 obligations are being met solely through the net metering program, and another third are being met by other solar developed through the standard offer program, utility contracts, or simply the purchase of renewable energy certificates from eligible resources. I will note too here that utilities must retire the renewable energy certificates assigned to them from net metering projects if those net metering projects were installed after 2017. So they do not have to, but they can retire renewable energy certificates from resources in the standard offer program or from contracts that they sign outside of these two programs. Moving to the chart on the left, those tier 2 resources, as I mentioned, count for tier 1 compliance. They're only 3.5% of the total compliance. Most compliance is from attributes associated with imports from Hydro-Quebec or other hydropower, including that in New England, and then imported from New York. Okay, so that was a lot of information and a pretty high-level overview of the renewable energy standard. We're going to go to the next slide and pause for questions. prior to getting into the standard offer program and the net metering program. And again, remember, we have a future webinar coming up to go deep into the understanding of renewable energy credits and those markets. Please, in the chat, send your questions to Claire McElveny as one of the hosts of this meeting, and she will facilitate a Q&A.
Thanks, TJ. I have a number of questions teed up as folks put additional clarifying questions in the chat. This first one goes back to the beginning kind of the presentation and wonders whether or not the department itself recommends updating the 2017 regs. I don't know if you want to speak to that quickly.
So the question is whether we recommend updating the renewable energy standard.
Yes, that's correct.
So I think that's the recommendation in the comprehensive energy plan was to consider what's needed going forward with our renewable energy policy, considering the renewable energy standard, considering net metering, considering standard offer, and how we could best move forward to appropriately balance the goals of our energy policy. So I think that is on the table for discussion. I don't want to prejudge the outcome of this process by saying, yes, we recommend we're going to update this. We really need to, but it certainly is on the table, and part of why we're doing this is that, you know, the way these programs are working together, we've highlighted some tensions in them and how they meet our energy policy goals.
Thanks, TJ. So next couple of questions go back to the REC, Renewable Energy Certificate explanation. I'm just wondering if you could repeat what it means to retire a REC.
Okay, so when you retire a REC, when a utility retires a REC, or it can be any entity can actually that has the rights to a renewable energy certificate can retire that certificate. And the way they do that is, you know, like I said, those renewable energy certificates are used for compliance for our obligations. Excuse me. The utilities, functionally, there's a tracking system that is called the NEPOOL GIS. It's the New England Power Pool Geographic Information System, and that's that mechanism that I mentioned where every attribute is tracked, whether it's renewable or not. And within that system, the entities can say whether those renewable energy credits are used for compliance with an obligation, or whether it is quote unquote retired. And retired is probably a term of art that is used in that system. And what happens when that renewable energy certificate is retired is that it's not able to be used by anybody else. Now, to create a renewable energy certificate, a generator must get acknowledgement from our Public Utility Commission that it qualifies for our renewable energy standard tiers. It also has to get permission in other states if that generator qualifies for, you know, different classes of renewable energy credits in those tiers. And so once it gets qualified, then that resource is in the system and can be kind of taken out of the market. I guess another way of saying retired would be taken out of the market, so nobody else can then use it.
Thanks, TJ. And this follow-up question gets a little deeper into those weeds. So if a REC is retired, does that mean that no future energy generated from that, for example, solar field, if that's what the plant is, will be able to be used again? Or does that mean that it is retired for the year and then there will be a new REC issued for that year?
Right, it's more the latter for that. So compliance for most renewable energy standards or portfolio standards are in a calendar year. and RECs are tracked really quarterly. And so every megawatt hour generated equals one renewable energy certificate. So if I generate 1 megawatt hour in 2023, then I can, I've generated 1 renewable energy certificate in 2023. When I generate 1 in 2024, I get a new certificate. And so I can retire that 1 that I generated in 2023. And then in 2024, I can decide what I want to do with that. I could sell it to somebody else to retire for their obligations. I could retire it, or I could just, I could keep it.
Thanks, TJ. And one more around RECs, specifically related to ones that are qualified as Tier 1 or Tier 2. Can Tier 1 RECs be used for Tier 2 requirements?
No, they cannot. So Tier 2 is kind of a carve out for Tier 1, and those but it goes the other way. Those Tier 2 RECs qualify for Tier 1. So again, Tier 2 is for a Vermont located generator that's relatively small in size, that was built after June 30th of 2015. And so that resource can generate RECs for the life of its operation. And those renewable energy credits are eligible to meet Tier 1. And in fact, if they are retired to meet your Tier 2 obligation, then that means they're also retired to meet your Tier 1 obligation. And so, that chart that we showed that had the Tier 2 kind of as piece of within the Tier 1 requirement there was an attempt to illustrate that. But Tier 1 can't be used because they're really different resources. They're usually older, and they and bigger, and they may not be in Vermont, and they don't qualify.
Thanks, TJ. And then we have a question here about, is there any distinction in RECs between new renewable energy generation as opposed to renewable resources that have been around for a long time, so older resources? And then a follow-up question similarly around whether or not there are other states that allow their utilities to use a similar share of, meet their requirements from a similar share of older renewable resources as we do here in Vermont.
Yeah, so there are the first question is, yes, there is a difference between kind of the older resources that were started generating before July 1st of 2015 and those resources that started generating after that date. And that is kind of a demarcation line for whether it would qualify for Tier 1 or for Tier 2. For instance, even a small solar plant that was installed and started generating in 2014, that actually wouldn't count for our Tier 2, wouldn't be eligible to be used to meet our Tier 2 obligations. That resource might be eligible. It is eligible to meet our Tier 1 obligations, but it is also eligible likely to meet obligations in other states from utilities in Massachusetts or Connecticut or Rhode Island, et cetera. So that the attribute of that resource might actually get sold to a utility in Massachusetts instead of being retired to meet any Vermont obligation. So there is a difference between kind of those newer and older. The second question is a little different. Do other states have allow for existing resources or larger or older resources to qualify in a manner that Vermont does? All the other states have different goals and requirements with their renewable energy. I'll point to Massachusetts as one that is kind of turning towards the way Vermont does its renewable energy standard, in that it has a renewable portfolio standard that has various tiers like Vermont does, with a number of different goals. There's a solar carve out, and there's other goals. Now they also have what more recently in the last couple of years passed what is called a clean electricity standard, or a clean E standard. And in that standard, there is a requirement for clean resources in which imported electricity and older units are eligible. I don't have the exact share off the top of my head here, but we can get that information. Connecticut also, well, let me continue with Massachusetts. Nuclear also counts for that clean E standard. So it's not just, notice I didn't call it a renewable E standard. So nuclear counts in that Massachusetts clean E standard. Connecticut also allows a certain percentage. I think that's a lower percentage for older units to qualify in its renewable portfolio standard as well. I think as states like Connecticut and Massachusetts have been increasing their requirements, they've been a little more broad in what is being allowed to qualify to meet the obligations.
Thanks, TJ. I just want to acknowledge that we have a lot of great questions coming in. I am just going to do one more so we can move on and make sure we get to all the material today, but we'll hold them and ask them at the end of the webinar if we have time, and then can think about how to get answers to some additional questions. We don't have time for them today, but one last question before we move on, TJ. Is it necessary for Vermont to participate in REC markets?
Is it necessary for Vermont to
participate in REC markets?
Is it necessary? So the last time, I think the Sustainably Priced Energy Enterprise Development Program was a program where we, our obligations were not required to be met by the retirement of renewable energy credits. And that led to a lot of concern. I think it led to the creation of our renewable energy standard, where we moved to using the REC compliance, because what happened was Vermont was entering into these long-term contracts and then selling the renewable energy certificates to entities who had obligations for new renewables in other states. The marketplace, nothing is absolute. I think you could create a marketplace where you didn't use renewable energy certificates for compliance and to ensure that you are actually supplying your energy or have the rights to the attributes of renewable electricity. But as it stands now, I haven't thought about this. This is an interesting question. Thank you for whoever asked it. I would have a hard time seeing us transition away from the way that all other 6 New England states are using the REC marketplace. So even if we didn't have that obligation, the resources would have the attributes, and there would still be a purchase and sale marketplace for the attributes, and our utilities would need to participate in that to ensure that their decision making kind of meets our energy policy requirements of least cost, considering environmental concerns and costs.
Thanks, TJ. I think we should move on to the next slide, but I am recording all the questions that have been sent to me. And like I said, we'll try and get to them at the end of the webinar, or think about how we can get answers after this time, if not.
Great, thanks, Claire. So I have just a few more slides, and then I'll save you from listening to me for too much longer. But we'll move on to talk about the standard offer program. And so this program was enacted in 2009, making long-term contracts at known fixed prices available to eligible facilities. Those eligible facilities were small, under 2.2 megawatts in-state renewable energy facilities. It was intended to stimulate that market through a centralized procurement mechanism, meaning that state government would be the contracting entity with a developer, making projects very financeable for developers. And then the government, through the Public Utility Commission, then would require electric utilities to purchase the power, passing through the costs and benefits associated with it. So as originally implemented, the program offered a fixed price that was set by the Public Utility Commission and opened a lottery where projects were accepted at that fixed price for development. This was really successful. The first 50 megawatts in the queue were filled immediately, but there was no certainty that those projects that were being proposed and developed were actually at the least cost. Like, everybody got that same price. So the program evolved in 2012. It opened another 77.5 megawatts through a request for proposals process that awarded contracts to the least cost bidder. So the total program was intended to solicit 127.5 megawatts of power, of capacity. As of now, the entire statutory allocation for the contracts have been awarded, with no new solicitations are scheduled because all the awards are out. However, if some projects drop out, then another solicitation may happen. Now, the chart you see on your screen there is the location of those projects that have been awarded. You can see most of it is solar. They're around the 2.2 megawatt size, although there are varying sizes of solar. There are some farm methane, which are above and beyond that statutory program cap, so they don't count towards that 127 megawatts. And a handful of hydro, wind, and food waste and biomass resources. Next slide, please. So the chart on your screen here shows the amount of capacity in megawatts. And again, that's the measure of power that's able to be provided instantaneously. And this shows what's been installed, with approximately 80 megawatts of capacity installed through 2022. The standard offer process was really envisioned in part over the years to support resource diversity. So you can see on this chart and the previous one, most of the projects awarded are solar projects, with those other few scattered in. I think when I think of this program, I think success in getting projects built and then evolving to a lower cost, but maybe less success with the resource diversity goal. Note the column on the right-hand side of this chart. That's the amount of megawatts that have not been built and awarded, about 50 megawatts. They've been awarded contracts and are in the permitting or construction process. In sum, just to give you a sense of scale, 127 megawatts total. Our peak demand for Vermont last year was around 960 megawatts. In 2022, that 80 megawatts that are installed produced about 126,000 megawatt hours of electricity. So that's about a little over 2% of Vermont's annual supply. Next slide, please. So I do want to note one other aspect of the standard offer program that is directed by statute. This standard offer has a baseload renewable power portfolio requirement that's intended to encourage plants that produce electricity essentially continuously at a constant rate. I read some more of a slide, even though I didn't really mean to. In practice, although the language is written not to say this baseload program is for one plant. In practice, this legislation supports one biomass facility in Vermont with a fixed price contract. That's the Rygate biomass facility, 20 megawatt facility. That contract, due to legislation that was passed last year, will extend to 2032 if the plant meets certain criteria related to efficiency requirements. So similar to other components of the standard offer program, the Public Utility Commission is the one who has a contract with the facility through an intermediary. And Vermont distribution utilities are required to purchase the energy and the renewable energy credits from that contract. So in the interest of time, I'll leave the standard offer for now, and then I'm going to turn it over to Deputy Director of Planning, Ann Margolis, to talk about net metering. And after that presentation, we can have questions on both standard offer and net metering.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Well, thanks for hanging with us till this long. I know there's a lot of interest in net metering. It's a subject of a lot of discussion. It's been the subject of many bills over the years before the General Assembly, and it evokes a lot of emotion in people. So we're just gonna try to keep it at the basic facts here. And I am gonna stay pretty high level. Some of my colleagues were worried I would require more than 15 minutes to get through about 5 slides. And I think we could probably spend an hour just scratching the surface of net metering. But I'm gonna try to keep it high level. And because of that, I will probably miss some nuance that those of you who are very familiar with net metering will want to point out, and feel free to do that in the chat or ask questions. But the examples I'll give are going to be specific to certain types of systems or situations, and I will not be able to provide a comprehensive look at every type of situation. So with those caveats in mind, here's an example of net metering, a graphic of one type of net metering system. So what is net metering? Why do we have it? Well, at its core, at its very heart, when it was first implemented almost, 3 decades ago at least, it was a way for customers to self-generate, to generate their own electricity from a system like this. You'll see here an on-site solar PV system, in order to reduce their load and offset the consumption that they would otherwise purchase from their utility. The program has existed since 1999. A lot of states implemented net metering around that time due to a federal law that required states to consider a net metering type of program where customers could self-generate and be compensated for the production from those systems at something like the retail rate. It's a retail rate basis for compensation. And what it really is a billing mechanism for customers to be able to receive that retail rate-based value for the production from their systems. Net metering has gone through a lot of permutations in its decades, as any one of us going through decades goes through many different changes. There were several significant bills passed by the legislature. We'll talk about those in a few slides, but significantly in 2014 with Act 99, the Public Utility Commission was told to go and design the program to accomplish a number of different goals and make some changes in keeping with some of the changes, such as the implementation of the renewable energy standard to try to have some compatibility with that program, and also to address some siting concerns that were coming up with the previous program. So the iteration of net metering that we're in right now, we refer to as net metering 2.0. It's not referred to that way in statute or in the over 50-page rule that governs net metering installations and compensation, but that's sort of the term that we've all adopted. So I'll be calling the program we're in right now net metering 2.0 or 2.12345. Those extra numbers I added there refer to the vintage of compensation. So we're in net metering 2.5 compensation right now. the current rule for net metering allows the Public Utility Commission to review the compensation rates for net metering production every 2 years. So we're in essentially the 5th iteration of compensation. Just to go a little more into the diagram here, this is a simple on-site solar photovoltaic or PV system on a rooftop. It's probably something like 7 kilowatts. And what it's doing is producing electricity from the sun that is being fed into the house, and it's reducing the consumption of that house from the grid. It's reducing the kilowatt hours that that house is drawing from the grid. It is also sending excess kilowatt hours out onto the grid. And if those are produced, when those are produced, those are offset within the billing period. So if you're a customer and you generate 100 kilowatt hours in a month, then you consume 200 kilowatt hours, that 100 will offset. So we'll really just be paying for 100 from the grid. If you produce more than you use within your monthly billing period, that is generation that you can get a credit for based on retail rate, and that credit can roll forward for 12 months from when it was generated. Next slide, please. I mentioned a bunch of other states have net metering policies. This is a slightly dated graphic here, but we appreciate these state summary maps from the database for state incentives for renewables and efficiency. You can see many states, the sort of blue-gray ones, have sort of a simple net metering program. I wouldn't call ours simple anymore, but where you have a retail rate-based compensation for self-generation or net metering. A lot of states are starting to talk about whether it's time to move away from this simplified net metering construct toward other ways of compensating small-scale distributed customer-sited generation. So some of those are in the green colors here, and I can imagine this is certainly going to be the topic of discussion throughout all of the engagement we do with you folks and others in this coming year. Next, please. So digging a little bit more into what does net metering 2.0 compensation look like? So if you are a customer and you want to install a net metering system, you have to go to the Public Utility Commission to get what's called a certificate of public good to build that system. And all of the utilities have to have approved tariffs that govern how they compensate you for the production of that system. So that compensation is basically in 2 major parts. One is how much does your system generate, and is it offsetting your load within that billing period, that monthly bill cycle, or is it what we would call sort of a group or virtual offsite system that is not connected to the load that it is intended to serve? So an offsite system would have subscribers, and they would receive a monetary credit on their bill that's associated with the production from that system and how much their share of that is. So that's one piece of your compensation. It's really just the retail rate based offsetting your consumption on a monthly basis. Then, depending on what we call the category of your system, you will get an adjuster. So if you are a small 15 kW or smaller, that's like your rooftop on-site system, you're a category 1 system. If you're slightly larger, category 2, and you are on a preferred site, so 15 to 150 kW on a preferred site. What's a preferred site? There's an asterisk here that lists out the types of preferred sites, but they're really rooftops, previously developed sites like capped landfills, brownfields, gravel pits. There's also a couple of other types of sites. One is a town designated site, and yet a third is when the system is on the property of the entity that's taking most of the production, so at least 50% of the production. Category 3 is 150 to 500 kilowatts on a preferred site. 500 kilowatts is the maximum size a net metering system can be. And then category 4 is 15 to 150, not on a preferred site. So you'll see there's a gap here. There's no category for 150 to 500, not on a preferred site. And so that would be sort of the larger group or virtual offsite systems. If it's not on one of these types of preferred sites, it doesn't have sort of a home in the net metering program. Just for reference, this picture shows a 180 kilowatt system. It's on a rooftop, so that's a type of preferred site. This would be then therefore a category 3 system. If you had a 180 kilowatt system on, not on a rooftop, it would take up a little bit more space than this because it would be on racking and it would be at an angle. The panels would be at an angle to capture the sun, and they would be spaced with some distance between them, but just for a sense of scale. So you will get your compensation based on what category you're in. And then you'll also get your compensation based on whether you assign those renewable energy certificates, back to those again, to the utility, or whether you retain them. If you retain them, some people might do that in order to call their the power from their system their own renewable power. If you assign the RECs to the utility, they have to retire those RECs toward their renewable energy standard obligation, their tier 2 obligation. And so that goes toward the renewability of the whole utility. Next, please. So you can see here, this is a summary table. Again, it won't capture all the permutations, and it doesn't apply to systems prior to 2017. Those are net metering 1.0 systems. They get paid a retail rate plus a solar credit. So that's not represented here. But you can see from 2017 through today how the program has changed. Every couple of years, the blended rate is changed, and that sort of is what you would get compensated for if you were one of those virtual offsite systems. But it's close to retail rate. So you're going to get paid that retail rate that's around this rate. And then you'll also, for every kilowatt hour your system generates, you will get paid adjusters, a REC adjuster and a category adjuster. So if we take a hypothetical category 2 system, it's maybe offsite on a preferred site, it's going to receive something close to this 17 cents. It's assigning RECs to the utility, so it stays 17 cents. And then 2 cents are taken off because of the category. So the net effect of that is every kilowatt hour generated is being paid 15.141 cents per kilowatt hour. Again, very simplified here, but you can get a sense of the range of compensation for different types of systems, sizes, sites, etc. Next, please. So I mentioned we've had a lot of changes to the net metering program over time. Some of these are captured here. I think one of the main takeaways here may be that, yes, we've had a lot of changes to the net metering program. We've gone from only farmers could do group net metering systems, and they were limited to 100 kilowatts, and utilities had a cap of 1% of that, their peak demand from 1996. TJ mentioned we have between 900 and 1,000 megawatts of peak load in the state. So we had, kind of a smaller program designed at serving on-site load, limitations on how many systems utilities were required to accept, to expanding to a 4% of peak demand cap, and then a 15% of peak demand cap, and then the cap went away. Group net metering was expanded to more types of entities. It expanded from a cap of 100 kilowatts to 250 to 500 kilowatts, 500 kilowatts being the maximum system size. We had a solar credit that went away and became transferred over to a system of adjusters. Meanwhile, not captured on here are things like the upfront incentives that used to be offered through the small scale renewable energy incentive program that the state used to administer. The variations in the investment tax credit, the federal investment tax credit over time, coming into being, shrinking, expanding, et cetera. But remarkably, we've had this still steady upward march in the cumulative installed capacity and, of course, number of net metering systems. Next, please. And just a last kind of way of looking at net metering installations over time. There's two ways of capturing the amount of installed systems and capacity. So on the left is the number of primarily solar. Most of the installations have been solar under net metering, but you can see most of the number of installations comes from what we would call category 1 systems, these small, generally rooftop systems, 15 kW and smaller. When you go over to the installed capacity, you can see most of the capacity, most of the solar resource comes from these larger 150 to 500 kW systems. So we've had over 17,000 systems installed. We have, I think, over 330 megawatts of net metering resources now. That's, you know, far above the 127.5 solicited through the standard offer program. So it's really one of our primary mechanisms that we've had to date, and one of the most successful mechanisms for procuring distributed renewable generation. It has primarily been solar, and it is, you know, definitely one of the areas where we're going to be hoping to get input from folks on what does this program look like going forward, and we welcome your input on that. I think that's probably the last net metering slide, and well, I haven't confused everyone by now. We'll find out. It's question time. Over to Claire.
Great, thanks everyone. So as a reminder, if you have any clarifying questions on the standard offer program or the net metering program, please put those in the chat directed towards me. And TJ, maybe if you want to take this one on the standard offer program, we have a question about how much of the standard offer program solar stays in Vermont. Have a sense of
that. The question was how much of it stays in Vermont. I think I don't have an exact number. So if the standard offer solar was constructed after July of 2015, it has a much better chance of staying in Vermont in terms of the renewable energy credits being retired to meet the tier 2 obligations, because then it would qualify for tier 2. Anything before that date has a pretty low chance of the attributes staying in Vermont, so to speak, in that they are utilities are essentially encouraged to get higher value for those renewable energy credits by selling them to markets in Massachusetts or Connecticut, where they can get a higher price to help lower rate pressure, and then replace those attributes with lower cost hydroelectric or tier 1 type attributes.
Thanks, TJ. And then just sticking with standard offer before we move to net metering questions, just a question about why so many of the standard offer projects have not yet been built.
Well, I think it does take a couple of years to construct, permit and construct a standard offer project when you have the, a potentially short construction season, although more and more that's less of a problem as long as the ground is frozen. So, over the amount of the solicitation has also grown in time. Originally, it was around 5 megawatts, and then it was 7.5 for a few years, and then the last several years were 10 megawatts. So I think that's part of the problem. There was a number of projects that were awarded contracts that were in litigation for several years. So they were awarded contracts, and there was a project that was right next, two projects were put in to bid, and as separate projects, they were right next to each other. And there was a lot of litigation around whether that was really met the requirements, the size requirements of the standard offer. And so things like that really take time. And then once a project finally does drop out, then it needs to go into the solicitation process, and then it's kind of starts the clock ticking again.
Great, thanks, TJ. And this one is for you around net metering. A question. My utility has labeled net metering as wasteful and redundant. Is that true? And if yes, why?
Well, I mentioned that there's a lot of discussion over net metering, and there is currently a proceeding that's going on if folks really want to dig into the various positions on net metering, which I expect that we'll be doing both in subsequent, engagements as well as in that proceeding. So it's another net metering rulemaking going on before the Public Utility Commission. The docket on that is, if you care, 19-0855-rule. And there's been a lot of discussion about whether, now that we have the renewable energy standard, whether the net metering program is providing resources that are required to meet the renewable energy standard at the least cost, and what other considerations should be factored in other than cost. So, there's land use planning, there's siting, there's customer engagement, there's economic development. There's a lot of lenses through which people look at renewable development, and whether, net metering is procuring, standard offer is procuring, utility contracts are procuring the types of resources that are going to meet our goals and are best meeting our goals and meet all the other requirements of statute around reliability, affordability, sustainability, really the legs of the stool of our energy policy. So I don't know if it's worthwhile to kind of get more into that. I'll leave that to TJ here, but I know we will be getting more into that in future engagements as we dig into each of these policies.
Thanks, Anne. A couple of clarifying questions here. One, going back to the slide with the compensation laid out, why are all the adders negative for the latest net metering credits to owners?
Well, the assign recs to the utility adjuster is 0, so it's neutral. But I mentioned that net metering is tied to retail rate, and this is really associated with the sort of jurisdiction that states have to set rates for programs versus basically the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission or the federal government, and states have jurisdiction over retail energy programs. And what makes net metering a retail energy program is tied to the distribution system, not transmission level generation, and it's tied to retail rate compensation. So when you start from that retail rate as a basis, you're kind of tied to that, so you can only go up or down from there. And in the biennial review, so the biennial review that the commission does is looking at the factors that they're directed to look at by the legislature in having a net metering program. So that is in the part of statute called Title 30, Section 8010. And they're required to look at, for example, the level of deployment necessary to achieve the state's energy policy requirements. And the primary requirement, as TJ's talked about earlier, for procurement of renewable electricity is the renewable energy standard. And I think we have a slide later on if we want to point to it, maybe slide 40. But just one of our extra slides, but it shows the level of deployment of net metering resources every year. So we are getting about the amount of deployment of net metering resources is approximately equivalent to what utilities need to meet their increase in their tier 2 obligation every year. And so in order to match up, you know, are we getting the level of deployment needed to meet the renewable energy standard? One of the main ways to throttle the level of deployment and make sure we're complying with all of those requirements of energy statute, reliability, affordability, least cost planning, we need to make sure, you know, the Public Utility Commission is looking at the level of deployment and how to modulate that. And one of the only kind of tool they have to modulate that, or one of their primary tools, is the adjusters. So you take an adjuster, that 17 cents, the retail rate basis, and you go down 2 cents, 15 cents. You can see from our increasing deployment, it's sufficient to deploy net metering, and it's encouraging the level of deployment of net metering sufficient to achieve, more than sufficient to achieve, in some cases, our renewable energy requirements. It's a pretty long-winded way of saying, when you have to start here, you know, going negative is one of the ways to get to an ultimate number that can only go up or down from that level basis of the retail rate. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks everyone for all your questions. I'm not sure we're going to get to all of them today. Like I said, we are recording all of them, but we'll see if we can do one or two before we pass it back to TJ to give some concluding talks about where we're going. But back to net metering. Why is net metering limited by the size of solar plant or plant in general?
I'm not sure if I'm going to totally capture the question or the intent of the question. The 500 kilowatt size limit is in statute. You know, net metering is as a mechanism to allow customers to offset their load. You know, you as a customer, a 15 kW system is going to be more correlated with your size of load, and a 500 kW would be associated with one very large customer or a bunch of small customer off-takers. You know, one of the primary discussions that's come up in, say, the net metering rulemaking is net metering systems are being paid, let's say, somewhere around 15 cents a kilowatt hour. I know there's nuances by category and rec disposition and vintage. Some systems are being paid more, so some systems are being paid less, but let's take that 15 cents as a basis. If you extrapolate it out, you know, to a larger size system, there is already a mechanism in the standard offer type program or utility procurements to achieve, you know, securing those types of resources for the power supply and the renewability for all of their customers at closer to 8-9 cents per kilowatt hour. And, you know, in a world where we're under least cost planning principles and we're trying to keep electricity rates affordable, especially for electrification purposes, you know, having larger net metering systems, if they were to be paid something like 15 cents versus 8 cents, you know, that would create tensions in pushing against affordability.
Thanks, Sam. And actually, we got a clarifying question on your response to the last question, which was, so if we increase the tier 2 requirement, i.e. support more in-state generation carved out, will we see adjusters that are more favorable for supporting expanded development?
There's a lot of suppositions, I guess, in that question. You know, if tier 2 were to be expanded, then there's a big question about what's the best way to meet tier 2. And is it net metering? Is it standard offer? Is it some other type of procurement program? What we have not talked about, the utilities have the ability to procure tier 2 resources through power purchase agreements, so direct contracts with in-state generation facilities that meet those requirements of being new and under 5 megawatts. So, you know, is the net metering program going to be, you know, how is it going to fit in that paradigm of any potential increase or change to tier 2, I think is to be determined and will be the subject of probably a lot more discussion.
Thanks, Anne. And one last question, and then we're going to turn it over to TJ to offer some kind of summary and next steps. But lost my question. So, and this touches on both programs. So between net metering and the standard offer program, Vermont has roughly 500 megawatts of solar installed. What is the combined percentage of Vermont load peak related to our peak and our total energy consumption?
Well, I think we have about around 500 is right. We have 516 megawatts, I think, of total distributed generation. That's not all solar. So 516 is about half of our peak load. And then generation wise, I'd have to calculate it out, but I think we'd be somewhere in the vicinity of 10%. TJ or others can correct me if that sounds off.
Yeah, that's about right. It's between 9 and 10% of our resource mix that's purchased or generated to meet the customer need, and before you consider the disposition of the renewable energy certificate.
All right, I'm going to pass it back over to you, TJ, just keeping in mind where we are time-wise. Thanks.
Right, great. Thank you, Claire. And we do want to be respectful of everybody's time that they're spending with us today. And so just circling back to what we said we were going to do, what we set out to describe at an accessible level Vermont's renewable energy standard, the standard offer program, and the net metering programs, and really how these policies and programs have impacted the adoption of renewable electricity over the last 20 years. You know, there's, I think, as you've heard, this is kind of challenging for us to not really dive really deep into the weeds, and which is really easy to do in this complex system, electric system that we have. So hopefully we were able to keep it at the right level here, and we'll look for feedback going forward. If you can go to the next slide. And just, you know, to that end, what we were hoping to just illuminate, I guess, is the tensions that we've seen where we have the renewable energy standard, which is really the most recent policy and program, and these other programs and resources that have been developed over time that are now kind of fitting under the umbrella of the renewable energy standard. You know, those programs kind of, we've said before kind of that they're developed in silos, and appropriately so at the time, but then not considering kind of the interaction between each other. And so moving forward, we really have this opportunity to look at these programs together and whether modifications might help them more cohesively and effectively meet our renewable goals and our climate requirements. Next slide, please. And so, you know, just want to circle back and touch quickly on this slide, which was in the last presentation as well. But these are the, you know, kind of the energy policy priorities that are articulated in Vermont statute. It goes to ensuring we have enough electricity, that the electricity is affordable, that it was procured cost effectively and efficiently, that we want to support as our own state's economic vitality. We want to do that equitably, sustainably, in an environmentally sound manner, and ultimately have our electricity be reliable. These are the things that have been balanced over time to create the programs we have, and, you know, absent change, these are the things we need to balance going forward, and that the state needs to think about as we evaluate those policies. Next slide. So we do have kind of a final poll here that we'd like to ask you to respond to if you want. Again, these are voluntary, but they're really helpful. They were really helpful in kind of helping us shape this presentation. We talk more about renewable energy certificates in part because of responses to these questions. So if you could, there's only 2 questions here, but they're short answer questions. What the biggest takeaway you had from today's presentation? It can be, something you learned that was new that you didn't know, or something that's reinforced, or, something, something different. And then going forward, what other topics would you like to hear more about? I mentioned we have more on renewable energy certificates coming. That's clearly, something that we want to make sure that we're speaking the same language, and there's a broad understanding of how those are used in Vermont and elsewhere. But other topics that you'd like to hear more about are really important too. Kind of could be the characteristics of each resource. It could be, the cost of each resource. It could be the benefit of each resource, and how all those things go together. Whatever you would like to hear more about. We'll just give you another 30 seconds or so to answer these questions. Okay, and as you're answering those, when I move on in the last 2 minutes here, you don't close the poll yet. I don't think you necessarily need to see the screen, but if you could advance the slide to next steps. Well, first, I think there may have been more questions than we had time to answer live here. We're going to try and figure out the best way to respond to those and get information, whether it's in the parking lot session, one of those sessions, or whether it is in a different manner. We also have the renewable energy credits webinar. You can register for those next 2 webinars at the link provided on the screen here where you registered for this one. And really just a big thank you for your attention today, the time you're taking to kind of learn about these issues. Maybe some of it, and this is just kind of building or enhancing your knowledge. Maybe it's just hearing how we're presenting this, and the perspective of what we're trying to do is just provide objective information here. But we really appreciate your attendance today, and we will have a similar to last time, we'll send out a follow-up brief survey. Those were also very helpful in kind of helping shape the future engagements that we have going forward. And with that, I think the next slide is the wrap up. Thank you all again, and you can contact us at this email to reach out or to be added to our mailing list, and just to stay in the loop. Thank you all, and enjoy the afternoon.